I put on the kettle and settled into my favorite chair by the window, overlooking the neatly trimmed lawn. Autumn Springfield was glistening with golden colors. But I wasn't looking at the trees. I was looking at the phone in my hands. I'd remembered Richard's number by heart for over 40 years, since we'd been at the same university. Back then, he had been a lanky guy with unbridled ambition, and now he was the head of one of the largest insurance companies in the city. Richard, hi, it's Constance, I said when a familiar voice answered after the second ring. Connie, what a pleasant surprise. How are you? How's your health? I'm fine, thank you. Listen, I need a little favor. You remember my son Jason? He's been working in your underwriting department for 5 years. Richard was quiet for a few seconds, apparently remembering. Tall brunette? Good with auto insurance? That's the one. Richard, I know there's a position opening up for your department head. Jason's very eager for the promotion, and I'd appreciate it if you'd consider him. Connie, you know nothing's impossible for me, but honestly, is the guy worth it? I don't want to do anything stupid for the sake of an old friendship. I grinned. Richard had always been straightforward, and I liked that. He's hardworking and responsible, maybe not the most creative, but he's efficient. He'll get the job done. All right, consider it done. I'll announce the appointment tomorrow. By the way, how's your sister-in-law? She's still a real piece of work, isn't she? I laughed. Richard had met Brittany at several corporate events and had a definite opinion of her. Brittany is still herself, but they're having a promotion party tonight. They're hoping it'll happen. It's definitely happening now. I'll see you the other day, Connie. Stop by for a cup of coffee sometime. I will. Thank you, Richard. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. 30 years ago, when Jason had been born, I'd never imagined that I'd ever have to negotiate a job for him as a child with no independence. It seemed then that my son would grow up strong and independent like his father, but life arranged it differently. My life has always followed a clear plan. Constance Elizabeth Sanford. That's what it says on my birth certificate 75 years ago. My parents gave me a beautiful name and a good upbringing, and I added to it persistence and cold calculation. First university with honors, then a job at a large law firm as a partner's secretary, where I met Edward. He was a young lawyer with big plans, and I was a girl who could listen and memorize every detail. Edward didn't notice me right away. For 6 months, I served him coffee, typed documents, and answered the phone, but I remained a piece of office furniture to him. Until one day I corrected him on a legal statement that could have cost the client a loss in court. That was the first time he really looked at me and saw not just a secretary, but a smart woman with a sharp mind. We were married 2 years later. I quit my job, as was the custom then, and took over the house. Edward often consulted me on complicated cases, and I read specialized literature and kept up with changes in the law. In effect, I was his unofficial partner, but without the salary and recognition. The kettle whistled, and I went into the kitchen. The refrigerator mirror reflected the face of a 75-year-old woman who looked 60 at most. Good genes, proper diet, and lack of bad habits did their job. My hair was a natural brown, the wrinkles around my eyes were barely noticeable, and my figure was slim thanks to my daily walks and yoga classes. Jason was born when I was 28, a long-awaited child after several failed pregnancies. I devoted myself to him, maybe even too much. I took him to every class I could, helped him with his homework, participated in school activities. Edward said I was spoiling my son, but I wanted to give him the best. Maybe that was my mistake. Jason grew up used to his mom always solving his problems. If he got a bad grade in school, Mom would talk to the teacher. At university, he failed an exam. Mom will find a way to fix the situation. At work, a conflict with a colleague. Mom will give advice or call the right person. I poured tea and returned to the living room. There was a card from Jason on the table with an invitation to the party. Mom, make sure you come. We want to celebrate the promotion with the family. Brittany will make your favorite dish. Favorite dish was a lie. Brittany, in 7 years of marriage, had never bothered to find out my culinary preferences. But I was used to turning a blind eye to such trivialities. Brittany came into Jason's life out of the blue. One day, a bachelor son, the next, a puppy in love, ready to do anything for the red-haired beauty. They met at the gym where Brittany worked as a fitness instructor. She was 24 at the time, with a model-like figure, $1 million smile, and ambition the size of a skyscraper. I sensed right away that this girl wasn't as easy as she looked. Too quickly, she'd gotten details about our family, about the house, about Edward's job, about our savings. She was too insistent about our future plans and the size of our inheritance. But Jason was blinded by love and didn't see the obvious. The wedding took place after 8 months of acquaintance. A lavish ceremony at an expensive restaurant that Edward and I had paid for because Brittany's parents were going through a rough time. The newlyweds left for their honeymoon in the Bahamas, and we stayed behind to sort through the bills and listen to our new daughter-in-law thank us. The time was 4:30. The party started at 7, which meant I had plenty of time to get cleaned up. I went up to the bedroom and stopped in front of the closet. The dark blue Chanel suit I'd bought last year would be perfect for such an occasion. Elegant, expensive, but not flashy, just what I needed for a family gathering. Since Edward's death 3 years ago, my life had changed dramatically. 47 years of marriage had ended abruptly. A heart attack in the office, intensive care, 3 days in a coma, and silence. I was alone in a big house with memories and a pretty decent fortune. Edward had been a prudent husband, good insurance, savings, stocks, real estate. Jason had asked me to move in with them, but I'd declined. I liked living on my own, not interfering with anyone or depending on anyone. I had my own habits, my own routine, my own social circle, friends from the book club, neighbors I had tea with on Thursdays, volunteer work at the animal shelter. I pulled out my suit and hung it on the door, then opened the jewelry box on my dressing table. Among the jewelry was a white gold necklace with sapphires, a gift from my husband for our 25th wedding anniversary. I took it in my hands and felt the familiar weight of the stones. Edward had spent 3 months choosing this necklace, going through all the jewelry stores in Springfield until he found exactly what he wanted. "Sapphires to match your eyes," he said then, fastening the clasp around my neck. We stood in the bedroom in front of the mirror, getting ready for our anniversary dinner at the restaurant. Edward was in a tuxedo, me in a champagne-colored evening gown. We looked like a couple on the cover of a fashion magazine, successful, happy, confident in the future. Now that necklace was one of the few things that connected me to my past life. I wore it only on special occasions, birthdays, anniversaries, important events. Today, my son's promotion could be considered an important event too, albeit achieved in a less than honorable way. I realized that by helping Jason with his career, I was making him even more dependent on me. But what else was there to do? Watch him sit in the same place for years, complaining about unfair bosses and dreaming of a better life? Or use my connections and give him a chance to prove himself in a higher position? Richard wasn't my only acquaintance in Springfield business circles. During my years of marriage to a successful attorney, I'd met a lot of influential people, bankers, judges, big business owners. All of them remembered Constance Sanford and were willing to do a small favor for the widow of an old friend. Jason didn't know the extent of my connections. To him, I was just a stay-at-home mom. He didn't see me studying Edward's every case, analyzing documents, and suggesting strategies. To my son, I was still the caring woman who made him breakfast and checked his homework. Brittany also underestimated me. In her eyes, I was a boring old lady with outdated attitudes that prevented a young family from living life to the fullest. She didn't hide her irritation when I came to visit, didn't invite me to family events with her friends, and constantly made it clear that my presence was unwelcome. But worst of all was her son's silence. Jason saw how his wife treated his mother, but he preferred not to notice. Mom, you know Brittany is stressed out at work. Mom, don't take it personally. She didn't mean to hurt you. Mom, try to get in her position. There were always excuses for the wife and pleas for patience for the mother. I took the necklace and put it on, clasping it in a familiar motion. The mirror reflected an elegant woman who could give many 40-year-olds a head start. The sapphires really brought out the color of her eyes and made her look aristocratic. Edward knew a thing or two about beauty. Over the past few months, his relationship with his sister-in-law had become strained. Brittany was no longer hiding her displeasure with my visits, saying that the elderly should be separated from the younger families, hinting at a nursing home as the best solution for everyone. Jason remained silent, occasionally mumbling something vague and turning the conversation to another topic. I knew exactly what was going on. Brittany wanted full control of the family and would not tolerate any interference. My influence over her son was interfering with her plans. My authority was undermining her position. She dreamed of the day when she wouldn't have to smile at her mother-in-law and pretend she was happy to have her in her home. But today she would have to smile. Today they are celebrating Jason's promotion, made possible by my call to Richard. Today, Brittany will thank me for my help and play the happy daughter-in-law, because she doesn't yet know who her husband really owes her new position to. I went downstairs and grabbed my car keys off the dresser. A silver sedan from last year's model was in the garage, ready to go. I got behind the wheel and drove into the street. It was a 15-minute drive through the center of town to my son's house. I turned on some classical music and relaxed in the driver's seat. Springfield looked especially cozy in the setting sun. The streets familiar from my childhood floated by, the homes of family friends, the park where I'd once walked with little Jason. He'd been such a lively, inquisitive child then, asking thousands of questions, dreaming of becoming a fireman and then an astronaut. Where is that boy now? When did he turn into a gutless man who lets his wife make all his decisions for him? I parked outside a familiar two-story house with red brick walls. Jason had bought it right after the wedding, taking out a hefty mortgage. I'd offered to help with the down payment, but my son had proudly declined, saying he could handle it on his own. The pride lasted exactly 6 months until it became clear that the young insurance agent's salary was not enough to cover all the expenses. The house looked well maintained, freshly painted shutters, neatly trimmed bushes along the driveway, a new mailbox with the last name Miller in gold letters. Brittany liked everything to look perfect, especially what the neighbors saw. Reputation meant more to her than comfort or sincerity. I walked up the porch steps and pressed the bell. Almost immediately, the door swung open and Brittany appeared in front of me, wearing a bright red dress and a strained smile on her painted lips. "Constance, how wonderful of you to come," she exclaimed, embracing me with exaggerated warmth. "Come in quickly. I've just put your favorite dish in the oven." Favorite dish. There's that lie again. In 7 years, Brittany had never once inquired about my food preferences, but now she was playing the caring daughter-in-law who remembered every detail. I smiled back and walked through the house, smelling the familiar scent of the cheap air fresheners Brittany used to mask the natural sense of home. "Where's Jason?" I asked, taking off my light coat. "He's in the living room, on the phone with a coworker. Can you believe they're already congratulating him on his promotion?" The news spread through the office instantly. Brittany sounded proud, but something in her tone seemed fake to me. Too much emotion, too much exclamation. It was like she was playing the part of the happy wife to an invisible audience. I walked into the living room, where Jason was actually on the phone, pacing the room in large strides. When he saw me, he raised his hand in a welcoming gesture and hurriedly ended the call. Mom! He came over and gave me a hug. Thank you for coming. You have no idea what a day this is. Richard Harrington personally announced my appointment as head of the department. I studied my son's face. At 35, Jason still had his youthful features, the round cheeks, the soft brown eyes, the habit of blushing when he was nervous. Now he was glowing with happiness, but there was something childlike and naive about it, as if he really believed that he had been promoted solely because of his merits. Congratulations, darling, I said, kissing him on the cheek. Tell me how it all happened. Richard called me into his office this morning. I thought I was going to be scolded for something. And he said, Jason, I've been watching you work for a long time, and I like your approach to business. I'd like to offer you the opportunity to head up the auto insurance department. Jason spoke excitedly, waving his arms and interrupting with enthusiastic comments. He truly believed in the validity of his appointment, unaware of my call to Richard that morning. There was something touching and sad about it at the same time. A grown man who'd never learned to really evaluate his own abilities. That's wonderful, I said. What did your colleagues say? Mark from the neighboring department was a little surprised, said that he did not expect such a rapid advancement, but the others congratulated sincerely. Jennifer even brought cakes in honor of my appointment. Brittany, standing next to her husband, cringed slightly at the mention of Jennifer. I remembered this co-worker of Jason's, a pretty blonde woman in her mid-20s, who made no secret of her interest in my son. Brittany had always been jealous of his younger female co-workers, though Jason was too simple-minded to notice female attention. Jennifer is very attentive, Brittany said dryly, always willing to help Jason with projects. There was a barely restrained distaste in her tone. I made a mental note of it. The family idyll wasn't as serene as my sister-in-law tried to make it seem. Mom, did you know that Richard Harrington personally oversaw my work? Jason continued. Apparently, he noticed how I handled complicated cases, how I communicated with clients, said I had potential for management. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything definite. Richard might indeed have said such words. He was diplomatic enough to clothe a favor to a friend in the form of well-deserved recognition. But it was a little awkward to listen to his son's enthusiastic account of his own talents. It's a big responsibility, I said. The head of the department not only has to be good at insurance, but also at managing people. I understand, Jason nodded seriously. But I'm ready. I've been reading a lot about management, studying the experiences of successful executives, and Brittany supports me. He put his arm around his wife's shoulders, and she clung to him in a show of family cohesion. But I noticed how the muscles in her face tensed when she smiled. That smile didn't reach her eyes and disappeared as soon as Jason looked away. Of course I do, Brittany said. Jason deserved this promotion. He'd worked so hard, worked so hard. Justice had been served. The words sounded right, but the tone betrayed insincerity. I caught something else in Brittany's voice, not just falseness, but tension, as if she were reciting a memorized text. What would the new position pay? I asked. 40% more than it is now, Jason said proudly, plus bonuses for a departmental performance. If all went well, we'd be able to pay off the car loan by the end of the year. The car loan. I remembered the story. 6 months ago, Brittany had decided they needed a new car, one that was more upscale and modern. Jason had resisted, talking about saving money, but his wife had insisted. Now they were paying off a monthly loan that was taking a serious toll on the family budget. That's wonderful news, I said. I hope your new position will bring you financial stability. Oh, yes, Brittany exclaimed. We've already made so many plans. We want to renovate the kitchen, change the living room furniture. Maybe we'll even take a vacation to Europe. Plans, plans, plans. Brittany was always living in the future, dreaming of things her family couldn't afford. She bought expensive cosmetics when she needed to save money on groceries, chose restaurants over home-cooked dinners, spent money on spa treatments while Jason put off buying new work suits. Europe is expensive, I said carefully. Not that expensive if you plan it right, Brittany said. Besides, Jason was the department head now. We need to live up to the status. Status, another of her sister-in-law's favorite words. For her, life was a constant demonstration of success to those around her. What mattered was not whether they were actually happy, but how they were perceived by neighbors and acquaintances. I glanced around the living room, trying to see the changes since my last visit. New cushions on the couch, expensive looking but clearly bought on credit, a painting on the wall that hadn't been there before, an abstract painting that didn't fit the interior at all, but looked modern and stylish, fresh flowers in a crystal vase that probably cost more than Jason's weekly paycheck. It's very cozy, I said, choosing not to comment on the obvious expense. Thank you. Brittany was obviously pleased by the compliment. I try to create an atmosphere of success in the house. You know what they say? The outside influences the inside, the environment. Brittany's whole life was built on the outside. A beautiful home they could barely afford, fancy clothes bought on credit, expensive restaurants instead of saving for the future. And now, with Jason's promotion, that race for status would only intensify. By the way, Mom, Jason said, we really appreciate your support over the years. I know you've always believed in me. There was genuine appreciation in his voice, but it was for general words of encouragement, not specific help in getting a promotion. Jason was thanking me for my motherly love, unaware of the call he'd made this morning. I'll always believe in you, I replied. The most important thing is that you believe in yourself. Of course he does. Brittany quickly stepped in. Jason has so much talent, so much potential. This promotion is just the beginning of a great journey. She spoke with enthusiasm, but I sensed that underneath the enthusiasm was something else. A calculation, plans, or just a desire to convince myself that my husband was really capable of more. The ringing of the timer in the kitchen interrupted our conversation. "Oh, dinner's ready," Brittany exclaimed. "I'll set the table. Jason, help me, please." They went into the kitchen, and I was alone in the living room. I took a moment to look around the room. On the coffee table were bills. I saw envelopes from the credit card company, phone service, and utility bills. Some were opened, others not. Nearby lay a notebook with Brittany's notes on it, shopping lists, renovation plans, budget calculations. I involuntarily peered into the notebook. The numbers didn't add up in the family's favor. Even with Jason's new salary, expenses exceeded income. Brittany planned to live as if her husband made twice the actual amount. "Constance, dinner's ready." My sister-in-law called out from the dining room. I closed my notebook and headed to the table, pondering what I had seen. My son's family lived in debt and illusions, hoping for a better future that might not come. And today's promotion only reinforced those illusions, giving Brittany an excuse for more spending and planning. In the dining room, the table was set for 8 people. White tablecloths, silverware that Brittany only got for special occasions, candles in tall candlesticks. Everything looked festive and expensive, though I knew most of it had been bought on credit or given as a wedding gift. "It's beautiful," I said, looking around the table. "Thank you." Brittany squared her shoulders with pride. "I wanted this evening to be memorable. It wasn't every day my husband got such an important promotion." She adjusted the napkins and rearranged the glasses, making sure they were in perfect symmetry. There was a nervousness in her movements, her gestures too abrupt, her glances at her watch too often. Brittany was anxious, and it was noticeable, despite her attempts to appear calm. "Who else is coming?" I asked. "Jason's co-workers, Tom and Susan, my friends Lisa and Karen, and their husbands. A small group, just the closest people. The closest people." Interestingly, that list didn't include any of my old friends or relatives from Edward's side of the family. The only people who mattered to Brittany were those who could appreciate their new status and envy their success. The first to arrive were Tom and Susan, a middle-aged couple Jason had worked with for several years. Tom was a short man with a neat beard, Susan a full-figured woman in a brightly colored dress. They brought a bottle of expensive wine and a bouquet of flowers. "Jason, congratulations, buddy." Tom shook my son's hand firmly. "Harrington has finally noticed your talents." "We are so happy for you," Susan added, hugging Brittany. "Jason has earned this promotion. He has always been one of the best employees." Jason was glowing with pleasure. He introduced me as his mother, and the coworkers said hello politely, though I could see that to them I was just part of the family entourage, not worthy of special attention. Brittany's friends arrived next. Lisa was a skinny brunette with sharp features who worked at a bank. Karen was a blonde with doll-like looks, the wife of the local dentist. Their husbands looked bored and had clearly only come because the wives insisted. "Num, Bree, darling," Lisa kissed the lady of the house. "What terrific news! Jason is now the head of the department." "We're so happy for you," Karen said. "Now you'll be able to afford so many things. Remember when we dreamed of a vacation in Italy?" There was a note of envy in their voices, carefully disguised as joy for their friend. These women were always competing with each other, who had the more successful husbands, who had the prettier houses, who had the more expensive vacations. Jason's promotion was upsetting the usual balance in their circle. Brittany accepted congratulations with the air of a queen who'd finally received her well-deserved crown. She talked about her husband's successes as if she were the architect of his career. She kept fixing her hair, tugging at her dress, and laughing nervously, signs of the tension she was trying to hide. We sat down at the table and small talk began. We discussed work, vacation plans, the latest news in town. I sat next to Jason and watched. The guests regularly toasted to my son's success. Brittany talked about the renovation plans, and everything seemed safe and happy. But I noticed details that eluded the others. Tom looked at Jason in surprise several times, as if he couldn't believe his assignment. Susan asked too many questions about the new responsibilities, trying to see if my son was really ready for the leadership job. "Jason, how many people will you be in charge of?" she asked. 12 auto insurance specialists," my son replied, "plus 2 secretaries and an analyst. That's a pretty big team. Do you know how you're going to organize the work?" Jason was confused for a moment, then began to outline the general principles of management, which he'd obviously read from books. He said all the right words, but he didn't have the confidence of a manager. Rather, he resembled a student who was answering a lesson in front of a strict instructor. Brittany quickly turned the conversation to another topic, talking about a new restaurant that had opened downtown. But I could see her scrutinizing her guests' reactions to her husband's words, how nervous she got every time someone asked an overly specific question about work. During the main course, the conversation turned to jewelry. Karen showed off the new earrings her husband had given her. Lisa bragged about a bracelet she'd bought on sale at an expensive boutique. The women compared purchases, discussed brands and prices with a frankness that was characteristic of their circle. "Constance, what a stunning necklace you have!" exclaimed Lisa, noticing my sapphires. "Is it antique?" "A gift from my husband," I replied briefly. "For 25th wedding anniversary." "Oh my God, what stones!" Karen leaned closer. "They're real sapphires, aren't they? Must be very expensive." I felt Brittany tense up. She looked at my necklace as if she were seeing it for the first time. Her gaze was filled with surprise, envy, and something else greed. Calculating. She studied each stone, assessing the setting, estimating the cost. Edward always had impeccable taste, I said, adjusting my necklace. He chose his gifts very carefully. What a romantic man your husband was, Susan sighed. Husbands rarely give such expensive surprises nowadays. Not everyone can afford it, Karen's husband said dryly. Brittany continued to stare at the necklace, something predatory in her gaze. She licked her lips, a barely perceptible movement that betrayed her inner state. I could see her mentally trying the jewelry on, imagining how she would look in it at social events. Do you often wear this necklace? Lisa asked. Only on special occasions, I said. Jason's promotion today was the perfect occasion. Of course, Brittany agreed quickly, but there was an unnatural note in her voice. We really appreciate Mom coming to share her joy with us. Mom, not Constance, not Jason's mom, just Mom, an impersonal reference that showed how Brittany saw me, not as a separate person, but as an extension of the family she'd gotten in addition to her husband. The conversation drifted to other topics, but I noticed that Brittany continued to sneak glances at my necklace. Her glances became more and more insistent, and her demeanor became nervous. She often touched her own cheap neck beads, comparing them to my sapphires. Tom told an anecdote about an insurance claim, and everyone laughed, but the atmosphere was somewhat strained. Too loud laughter, too active gestures, too vivid emotions. It was as if everyone present was playing the roles of happy people, but not really believing it. And how are things with the inheritance? Suddenly asked Lisa, turning to me. Forgive me for the direct question, but after the death of her husband, there were probably some issues with the property. An awkward silence hung over the table. Jason blushed. Brittany froze with her fork in her hand, and the guests looked at each other. Lisa asked the question that everyone was mentally formulating, but no one dared to say out loud. All the questions were answered, I said calmly. Edward was a thoughtful man. Of course, Jason said quickly. Mom doesn't want to discuss the subject. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be tactless, Lisa said, embarrassed. It's just that my father died recently, and we're in such a mess with the paperwork. That's okay, I smiled. Inheritance matters are always complicated. Brittany breathed out a sigh of relief, but I could see how intently she was listening to the conversation. The topic of money and inheritance clearly interested her more than anything else. She looked at me with a new gaze, evaluating, calculating. Karen's husband began to talk about the problems at the dental office, and the tension gradually eased. But I continued to watch Brittany. She was smiling, keeping the conversation going, playing the role of a hospitable hostess, but her gaze kept returning to my necklace. At one point, she leaned toward me and said quietly, Constance, may I look at your necklace more closely afterward? I have never seen such beautiful sapphires. Of course, I replied, though something in her tone made me wary. The rest of the dinner passed in the usual small talk. The guests praised the food, Jason accepted congratulations, and Brittany showed off her skills as a hostess. But beneath that benign surface, I could feel the tension building, the source of which was my sister-in-law. Dessert was served in the living room. Brittany brought a cake of her own making, chocolate with cream roses, and the words, Congratulations, Jason, in gold lettering. The cake looked professional, but I knew my sister-in-law had bought it from an expensive candy store and passed it off as homemade. Another little lie to add to her constant pretense. Bree, you're a real magician, Karen exclaimed. How do you manage to balance work and home and still find time to bake like that? It's all about organization, Brittany said modestly as she cut the cake into portions. When you love your family, you can do anything. I watched as she handed out slices to the guests, as she accepted compliments with the look of a woman who had actually spent half a day in the kitchen. There was a feverish energy in her movements, her hands shaking slightly as she served the plates. Jason sat in a chair, accepting congratulations and talking about his plans for his new position. He talked about reorganizing the department, introducing new technology, improving efficiency. The words were right, but behind them, there was no real understanding of what was to be done. Jason, have you met with your team yet? Tom asked. Tomorrow morning, I have my first meeting with my subordinates, his son answered. I want to get to know each person personally, to find out their strengths and areas for development. That's the right approach, nodded Lisa's husband. In our company, new managers always start by studying the team. The conversation flowed smoothly from topic to topic. They discussed plans for the weekend, the latest movies in theaters, rumors about personnel changes in the city companies, the usual small talk of successful middle-class people who could keep the conversation light and still seem interesting. Brittany was pouring coffee, offering cognac to the men, bustling around the guests. But I could see how often her gaze rested on my necklace. She was no longer trying to hide her interest. She was looking at the jewelry openly, examining each stone. Constance suddenly turned to me, Lisa. And can I ask where your husband bought such a necklace? I have a wedding anniversary coming up. I want to give my husband something special. It was a long time ago, I answered. Edward bought it at Tiffany's Jewelry in New York. We were traveling there on his business. Tiffany's? Karen gasped. That was insanely expensive. Edward didn't like to skimp on gifts for the woman he loved, I said, smiling involuntarily at the memory of my husband. Brittany set the coffee pot down on the table. The sound was louder than it needed to be, and everyone turned to look at her. I'm sorry, she mumbled. I'm a little tired from the hassle. But it wasn't tiredness I saw in her eyes, but something else entirely. Anger, envy, or just a keen desire for something that belonged to someone else. I think expensive jewelry like this should be worn more often, Susan said. Why keep beauty in a box? I agree, Lisa said. Life is short to save beautiful things for special occasions. Everyone has a different approach, I calmly replied. I like that the necklace remains special, associated with important moments. And what will happen to it next? Brittany suddenly asked. I mean, it's a family heirloom. It's supposed to be inherited. An awkward silence hung in the air. Jason blushed and started to say something about it being too early to think about such things. But Brittany wasn't listening. She was staring at me, waiting for an answer. Time will tell, I said. As long as I'm alive and well, I'll keep the necklace. Of course, Brittany agreed quickly, but there was disappointment in her voice. I was just thinking, in the future, someday. She didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. My sister-in-law was already mentally trying on my necklace, planning its future around her neck. The impudence of this assumption struck me, but I restrained myself and did not pursue the subject. The time was nearing 11:30. Tom was the first to glance at his watch and say that it was time for them to go home. Tomorrow was a work day. The rest of the guests took up the initiative, and the traditional goodbye and thank you for a wonderful evening began. Jason, congratulations again, Tom said, shaking my son's hand. I'll see you at the office tomorrow. I'm sure you'll make a great leader. Bree, darling, it was wonderful, Susan added, hugging her hostess. You're a real hostess, and that cake was divine. Brittany's friends were also complimentary. Lisa praised the table setting. Karen admired the living room decor. Their husbands nodded silently and waited patiently for their wives to finish the ritual of saying goodbye. Constance, it was so nice to meet you, Lisa said, shaking my hand. And your necklace is stunning. I hope to see you again. Of course, I smiled, though I sincerely doubted it. When the door closed behind the last of the guests, the house was silent. Jason was picking up empty glasses and plates, and Brittany stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the napkins and crumbs on the table. The festive atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by the usual domestic fatigue. "Thanks for coming, Mom," Jason said, balancing a stack of dishes. "It was nice to celebrate together." "It was nice for me, too," I replied, though the last hour of the party had left a strange aftertaste. Brittany was silently picking up napkins from the floor. I noticed that she avoided looking at me directly, but her gaze kept slipping to my necklace. Those furtive glances were a mixture of jealousy, desire, and something else determination. "Jason, take the dishes to the kitchen," she said to her husband. "I'll wash them later." "Why don't we leave it till morning?" her son suggested. "You're tired." "No, I'd rather do it right away. I don't like dirty dishes at night." Jason obediently went to the kitchen with his hands full of plates and glasses. We were alone. Brittany continued to clean, but her movements were sharper, more nervous. "What a wonderful evening," I said, breaking the silence. "Yes," Brittany replied briefly, keeping her head down. The guests had clearly enjoyed themselves, and the cake was really good. "Thank you," my sister-in-law said even more dryly. I could feel the tension building. Something about Brittany's demeanor was unsettling. Her movements too focused, her back too tense, her breathing too rapid. It was as if she were preparing for something important. "Constance," she said, suddenly straightening up, "may I have a closer look at your jewelry? I've been admiring it from afar all evening." "Of course," I said, though something in her tone seemed unnatural. Brittany stepped closer and put her hand around my neck, but instead of gently examining the necklace, she suddenly grabbed it and yanked it toward her. The chain dug into my skin, and I cried out in surprise and pain. "What are you doing?" I asked indignantly, grabbing her arm. "That jewelry was supposed to be mine," Brittany shouted, continuing to tug on the necklace. "I'm my son's wife. I'm supposed to wear the family jewelry, not watch an old woman flaunt it." We struggled for a few seconds. Brittany pulled the necklace toward me, and I tried to free myself from her grip. The clasp broke, and the jewelry slipped off my neck. Brittany clutched it in her fist, holding it to her chest. "Give it back right now," I demanded, rubbing my scratched neck. "I'm not giving it back." Brittany took a few steps back. "Stop playing queen. Stop humiliating us with your wealth. Why do you have everything and we have nothing?" At that moment, Jason came back from the kitchen. When he saw us in this position, mother with a scratched neck and wife with a piece of jewelry in her hands, he froze on the doorstep. "What's going on here?" he asked, confused. "Your wife is taking my necklace away from me," I said coldly, "and you're going to keep your mouth shut as usual." "Brittany, what's wrong?" Jason turned to his wife. "Give the jewelry back to Mom." "Don't you dare tell me what to do," Brittany shrieked. "You're always on her side. Your precious mommy is bossing us around, and you don't say a word. She's rich and we're living in debt." "You're in debt because you spend more than you earn," I replied. "Not because I don't share my money with you." "That's a lie." Brittany clutched her fist with the necklace even tighter to her chest. "You're a greedy old woman who doesn't want to help her son's family." Jason stood between us, opening and closing his mouth, but not saying a word. At the critical moment when a choice had to be made between mother and wife, he chose silence. I pulled my cell phone out of my purse. My fingers automatically dialed a familiar number. I could call Richard even in my sleep. "Mom, what are you doing?" Jason asked, noticing the phone. "Something I should have done a long time ago," I answered and put it on speaker. "Connie?" Richard's voice sounded sleepy. "Is everything okay?" It was a little late for a call. Richard, I'm sorry to bother you, I said calmly. I have a business question about Jason Miller. Your son? There was a note of concern in my friend's voice. Did something happen? Brittany's face began to turn white. Jason took a step forward, but I stopped him with a gesture. You could say that. Richard, this morning you made him department head at my request. But now I see that I misjudged his humanity. Mom, no, Jason screamed. Don't. Connie, I don't understand, Richard said. You're the one who asked for a promotion for your son. What's the problem? The problem is that Jason turned out to be a man with no principles and no backbone. I answered, keeping my eyes on my son. He let his wife attack his own mother and steal a family heirloom, and he was silent while doing it. Constance, please, Brittany pleaded, still clutching the necklace. This is a misunderstanding. I'll give it back. Too late, I said coldly. Richard, I'm asking you to cancel Jason's appointment. A man who can't protect his own family is not fit to be in charge. Mom, please. Jason fell to his knees. Don't ruin my career. I'm not ruining it, I said. You did it yourself by your silence. Connie, are you serious? Richard asked. After all, tomorrow morning he has to start his new duties. I'm dead serious. Find a way to cancel the appointment. Tell him that circumstances have come to light that make him unsuitable. Brittany sobbed, still clutching my necklace in her fist. Jason lay on the floor with his hands over his face. I stood over them, holding my phone and feeling a strange sense of relief. Connie, are you sure about this? Richard's voice came gently through the phone's speaker. These are serious allegations. Absolutely sure, I replied, not taking my eyes off my son lying on the floor. Richard, I would never ask you to do this if I wasn't completely convinced that what I was saying was right. All right, he sighed. Tomorrow morning I'll find a way to explain the cancellation. Maybe I'll say that I need to do some additional vetting or that the requirements of the position have changed. Thank you for your understanding, I said. Good night. Good night, Connie. I turned off the phone and put it in my purse. There was dead silence in the living room, broken only by Brittany's sobs. Jason rose slowly from the floor, his face wet with tears. Mom, he started, but his voice trailed off. Don't, I stopped him. It's all been said. Brittany stood at the window, clutching my necklace to her chest. Tears smeared her makeup, and her red eyes looked at me with despair. She no longer looked like the confident woman who'd hosted me a few hours ago. Now she was a confused, frightened person who suddenly realized the magnitude of her mistake. Constance, she whispered, please, let's discuss this calmly. I realize what I did was wrong. But it can be undone, can't it? Some things can't be undone, I replied, especially when they reveal a person's true nature. But I didn't mean to. Brittany took a step toward me. It's all emotion fatigue. I've been preparing for the party so much, nervous to make it perfect. Fatigue is no excuse for stealing, I said coldly. Certainly not a physical assault. Jason wrapped his arms around his head and sank heavily into his chair. His career plans had been ruined in 5 minutes on the phone. Tomorrow morning, he'd have to go to the office, not as the new department head, but as a regular employee who'd been denied a promotion for reasons unknown. 35 years, he muttered. 35 years, and this is how it ends. Nothing ends, I said sharply. It only ends with you parasitizing my reputation and connections. Mom, you offered to help, didn't you? Jason exclaimed, his eyes wide with resentment. I didn't ask you to call Richard. That's right, I nodded. You didn't. You were just complaining about unfair bosses and wishing you had a better life. And I stupidly decided to help. My mistake. Brittany continued to stand at the window, clutching her necklace. Her posture was desperate. She knew what she'd done, but she didn't know how to fix it. It was the first time in all the years I'd known her that I'd seen her truly afraid. "What's gonna happen now?" she asked quietly. "What's supposed to happen?" I answered the question with a question. Jason will continue in his former position, unless, of course, he is fired for misconduct. You will live on the salary he actually earns on his own. "But we can't," Brittany exclaimed. "We have loans, mortgages, expenses. We were counting on a raise." "Then you'll have to rethink your lifestyle," I replied dryly. "We'll have to learn to live within our means." Jason lifted his head and looked at me with a hatred I'd never seen in him before. It was resentment, anger, and something else. Despise. "So, you planned this whole thing?" he asked. "To help you get a promotion and then take it away? To show us where we belong?" "I didn't plan anything," I answered. "I just saw tonight what my son and his wife had really become." "We've become people who are tired of your arrogance," Jason blurted out. "All your life, you've spent your life lecturing us, criticizing us, showing us your superiority." "I show superiority?" I asked in surprise. "That's an interesting point." "Yes." He jumped up from his chair. "Your expensive jewelry, your big house, your powerful friends. You keep reminding us that we're losers." "I never said you were losers," I objected. "It's your inferiority complex, not my fault." Brittany suddenly burst into hysterical laughter. She laughed, holding her hand with the necklace to her face, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she couldn't stop. "Inferiority complex," she gasped, she said. "Do you hear that? We have an inferiority complex. She just has good genes and a rich husband." "Brittany, calm down," Jason tried to intervene. "I'm not gonna calm down," she shrieked. "You know what, Constance? I'm glad I got that damn necklace off you. I'm glad I showed you what I think of your false grandeur." "Give it back," I demanded. "And if I don't?" Brittany raised her fist with the necklace above her head. "What are you gonna do? Call the police? Tell everyone how your own sister-in-law humiliated you?" "Don't push your luck," I warned. "I have enough influence in this town to make your life very unpleasant." "Threatening?" Brittany took a step toward me. "A rich lady threatening her poor relatives?" "I'm just stating the facts," I replied calmly. "Richard is not the only person I know in business circles. Bankers who approve loans, realtors who help sell houses, employers who make hiring decisions." Brittany's face paled. She was beginning to realize that she wasn't dealing with a defenseless old lady, but with a woman who had real leverage. "You wouldn't dare," she said uncertainly. "Try me," I suggested. "Let's see which one of us is stronger." Jason watched our verbal duel in silence. His eyes were confused. He hadn't expected his mother to be so tough. To him, I'd always been a caring mom, the kind who solved problems and helped in times of need. Today, he saw a different side of my personality. "Mom," he said cautiously, "maybe we can find a compromise after all. We are a family." "Family?" I looked at him in surprise. Family is when a son protects his mother from his wife's aggression, not just stand by and keep quiet. I was confused. Jason excused himself. "It all happened so fast." "You weren't confused," I corrected him. "You made a choice. You chose not to get involved, not to fight with your wife." "That's not true." "It's a truth you don't want to admit," I said. "You always take the path of least resistance. At school, at university, at work, in marriage. That's why you don't have a career without help." My words hit the mark. Jason clenched his fists, but he didn't object. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew I was right. Brittany, meanwhile, slowly unclenched her fist. The necklace lay in her palm, the sapphires glinting dimly in the light from the desk lamp. She looked at the jewelry as if she was seeing it for the first time. "You know what the funny thing is?" she said quietly. "I don't even like this necklace. It's too old-fashioned, too heavy. I would never wear it. Then why did you steal it? I asked. I don't know, Brittany answered honestly. I just, I just wanted to take something away from you, to show you that you weren't all powerful. Well, I said, that's accomplished. You've shown that you're capable of theft and violence. Now give me back the necklace. Brittany held out her hand to me with the jewelry. I took the necklace and examined it closely. The clasp was broken, but the stones were still in place and the setting was intact. It could be repaired. Now I'm going home, I said, putting the necklace in my purse. Constance, wait, Brittany exclaimed. We can talk about this. Find a solution. What solution? I asked, stopping at the living room door. I'll apologize. Publicly, in front of everyone, I'll admit my mistake. And what would that change? Maybe you'll change your mind about Jason's job. I looked at both of them, at my sobbing daughter-in-law and my son with his head down. Two adults who'd tried to solve their problems at my expense and were now begging for forgiveness. No, I said. I wouldn't change my mind. Some lessons need to be learned before the end. I headed toward the hallway, feeling Jason and Brittany's intense stares behind me. My footsteps sounded especially loud in the silence, my heels tapping on the floor like a metronome, counting down the last seconds of our family's prosperity. Mom, stop! My son's voice made me slow down, but not stop. I kept walking toward the front door where my coat hung. With all of today's events, I had almost forgotten that just a few hours ago, I had come here in a joyful mood, ready to share my son's moment of triumph with my family. Mom, please don't go like that. Jason caught up with me in the hallway. Let's talk calmly. I turned to him. His face was red with tears and worry, his hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled. He looked like a little boy who had done something terrible and was now apologizing to his mom. What was there to talk about? I asked, taking my coat off the rack. I thought I'd made myself very clear tonight. But you can't just ruin my career. There was desperation in his voice. It's my life. I didn't ruin your career, I said, putting on my coat. I just withdrew my help. Big difference. What difference? The result is the same. I buttoned the buttons and turned to my son. He was beginning to realize the magnitude of what had happened. Tomorrow morning, he'd have to explain to his coworkers why the promised promotion hadn't happened. Jason, I said patiently, the way I'd talked to him when he was a kid, when he didn't understand the obvious. You didn't get the promotion because of your talents or your hard work. You got it because I asked an old friend for a favor. So, he shrugged, everything in business is built on connections. Maybe. But when those connections work in your favor, you make certain commitments, like not embarrassing the person who helped you. Brittany appeared in the opening between the living room and the hallway. She stood leaning against the door jamb, silently watching our conversation. Her face was swollen with tears, her makeup smeared, but there was something sly in her eyes, as if she were considering a new plan of action. Mom, Jason grabbed my hand. Understand, we didn't mean to hurt you. She's been really tired lately. Work, the house, all the party preparations. Damn, tired doesn't justify attacking someone and stealing, I said coldly. And it certainly doesn't excuse your silence. I was not silent, he objected. I told her to return the necklace. You only said that after she had already committed the theft. And when she was attacking me, you stood there and watched. Jason lowered his head. He knew I was right, but he wasn't ready to admit his own cowardice. He'd spent his whole life avoiding conflict, hoping that problems would resolve themselves. And today, that habit was playing tricks on him. Constance, Brittany stepped forward. Can I say a few words? I looked at her expectantly. My sister-in-law squared her shoulders and tried to put a determined expression on her face, but her hands were still shaking. I realize what I've done is disgusting, she began, and I'm willing to be punished. But why should Jason suffer? It wasn't his fault. Not his fault? I questioned her. He let his wife attack his own mother. You call that not his fault? He was confused. Brittany spoke passionately. The situation was shocking, unexpected. Anyone would have been confused. Any decent man would have defended his mother, I corrected her. He wouldn't look for excuses for an aggressive wife. Brittany bit her lip. She tried to find an argument that would change my mind, but she realized that logic wasn't on her side. Okay, she said finally. Suppose you're right. Suppose we're both guilty. But we could find another punishment, couldn't we? Something less cruel? Like what? I asked. We we could work off our guilt, Brittany suggested tentatively. Helping you around the house, for example. Or I could get a second job to make up for the damage. What damage? I was surprised. The necklace is intact. The clasp can be repaired. Well, moral damage, she mumbled. I smiled involuntarily. Brittany was willing to do anything to get her husband's promotion back, but her suggestion sounded naive and desperate. My dear, I said softly, you still don't understand the problem. I don't, Brittany said honestly. The problem isn't the damaged necklace or the ruined evening. The problem is that you both showed your true colors, and I don't like that face. Jason lifted his head and looked at me with pain in his eyes. So, you don't love us anymore? He asked, and there was a childish tone in his voice. The question struck me as naive. My 35-year-old son was still thinking in the terms of a child, for whom the love of parents is unconditional and independent of their actions. Love and respect are different things, I replied. I will always love you because you are my son, but I can't respect you after tonight. But people change, Brittany exclaimed. We can be better. Maybe, I agreed, but not under my leadership and not at my expense. I opened my purse and pulled out my car keys. The metal felt cold under my fingers, and the sensation helped me focus. It was time to end this conversation. Mom, Jason grabbed my hand as I reached for the doorknob. I know I've disappointed you, but give me one more chance, one single chance to make things right. With what words? I asked. What are you gonna fix? Yeah, I'm gonna be more determined. I'm gonna protect you from Brittany if she misbehaves again. If she misbehaves again? I interjected. So you're saying that's a possibility? Jason hesitated, realizing that he'd said too much. No, that's not what I meant. That's exactly what you meant, I interrupted. You don't trust your wife and you're not sure she can control her behavior. That's not true, Brittany intervened. Today was exceptional. Exceptional? I looked at her questioningly. Or just the first time you've ever been caught in the act. What do you mean by that? I mean that people don't become thieves and aggressors overnight. It's the result of a long process of character degradation. Brittany turned pale. My words hit the target. It really wasn't the first time she allowed herself inappropriate behavior. It was just that it happened without witnesses before. You have no right to judge me, she flared up. You don't know what it's like to live under constant stress for money. I don't? I was surprised. Honey, I grew up in a family where every penny counted. My father worked in a factory. My mother took home jobs to make ends meet. But then you married a rich lawyer, Brittany said accusingly. Then I married a poor lawyer who was just starting out, I corrected, and he got rich through hard work and my support. So you were lucky. Lucky? I laughed. Honey, luck had nothing to do with it. Edward and I worked day and night, saving money, investing every dollar in the future. You're spending money you don't have on things you don't need. Brittany couldn't find anything to say. She stood there, biting her lip and avoiding my gaze. Mom, Jason spoke again. Maybe the problem is that we're too different. Different generations, different ways of looking at life. Maybe, I agreed. And that's why we'd be better off apart. What do you mean? I mean that our relationship needs to be reevaluated. No more financial help, no more patronage, no more favors through acquaintances. Jason turned pale. He was beginning to realize that he was losing not only his promotion, but also the support he'd counted on all his adult life. But we're family, he exclaimed. Family is mutual respect and support, I replied. We have a one-sided relationship. You take, I give. It won't be like that anymore. I turned the doorknob and stepped through the door. The cool night air felt good against my heated face. It was quiet outside, with music playing in the distance. Probably the neighbors were having a party. Constance! Brittany followed me out onto the porch. Wait, let's make a deal. Negotiate what? I asked without turning around. I realized I was wrong. I realized I deserved to be punished. But Jason, he's a really good man. He's just weak-willed. I stopped and turned to her. Brittany was standing on the porch in her house shoes, arms wrapped around herself. Without makeup and in the dim light of the street lamp, she looked much older than her 32 years. A weak-willed man is a bad husband, I said, and certainly not a good leader. But you can build character, she insisted. Teach him to be firm. At 35? I asked skeptically. Honey, character is built in childhood. And Jason got everything he wanted as a child without any effort on his part. Then that's your mistake, Brittany exclaimed, and then covered her mouth with her hand in fear, realizing she'd said something she hadn't meant. My mistake, I agreed calmly. And today, I'm going to start making it right. I walked down the steps and headed for the car. Brittany stood on the porch, hesitant to follow me barefoot down the cold driveway. Constance, she shouted after me, we can change everything. Just give us time. I got into the car and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, I saw Jason come out onto the porch and put his arm around his wife, who was shivering from the cold. They stood in the light, like actors on stage, staring at my car. I pulled out of the driveway and drove home through sleeping Springfield. It felt strange, heavy and light at the same time. Heavy because I had to sever my relationship with my son. Light because I no longer had to pretend I couldn't see their true nature. In my purse was Edward's damaged necklace, the only material loss of tonight. All the other losses were emotional, but perhaps necessary. Sometimes you had to shatter illusions to see the truth. The drive home took the same 15 minutes as it had this morning, but it felt like I was driving through a completely different city. Familiar streets looked alien in the light of the sparse streetlights, familiar turns requiring extra attention. Or maybe it wasn't the road, but me, the inner upheaval that had taken place in a matter of hours. I drove into my neighborhood, where houses stood on large lots surrounded by old trees and high fences. People of my generation and social status lived here, successful professionals who had worked their whole lives to ensure a peaceful old age. Most of the windows were dark. Respectable neighbors went to bed early and rose early. My house greeted me with the dim light of automatic motion sensors. The two-story red brick building with white shutters looked solid and sturdy, just as Edward and I had envisioned it 30 years ago, when we'd bought the lot and hired an architect. I put the car in the garage and walked through the inner door. The familiar silence of a large, empty space greeted me in the hallway. I hadn't gotten used to that silence since my husband's death, even though it had been 3 years. Edward used to always greet me when I came home late, asking me how my day was, helping me take off my coat. Today, there was no one to tell me what had happened. There was no one to complain about my son's ingratitude or to discuss the rightness of my decision. Edward had always been my main advisor, the person whose opinion mattered more than anything else. I went into the living room and turned on the floor lamp by my favorite chair. The room filled with soft, warm light, highlighting the familiar details of the interior, the antique secretaire we'd bought at an auction in the early years of our marriage, the paintings on the walls, collected over decades, the silver-framed photographs on the mantelpiece. Special among the photos was a portrait of Jason on graduation day. The 22-year-old in his academic robe smiled at the lens with the optimism of youth. It seemed then that all roads were open to him, that an honors degree and letters of recommendation from his professors would guarantee a successful career. I sat down in the chair and took the damaged necklace out of my purse. In the light of the lamp, the damage didn't look so serious. The gold chain had broken in one place. The clasp was bent, but the sapphires were intact. Tomorrow the jewelry could be taken to a jeweler, and in a few days it would be good as new again. But some things couldn't be repaired as easily. The relationship with her son, for example. Trust that takes years to erode and breaks completely overnight. Illusions about the kind of person your child grew up to be. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting myself remember all the times I'd helped Jason and his family. How many times had I gone to their house with groceries when I knew I wouldn't have enough money to get through paycheck to paycheck? How many times have I paid their bills, pretending it was an accident or a gift? I remember when Brittany casually mentioned 3 years ago that they wouldn't be able to go on vacation because the air conditioner in their car broke. The repair cost $1,500, which they didn't have. I arrived the next day with a check, explaining that I had received an unexpected tax refund and wanted to share the good fortune with my family. Or the story of the new bedroom furniture. Brittany had been complaining for months about the old bed that creaked and interfered with sleep. Of course, they couldn't afford a quality set for $4,000. And of course, I accidentally saw an ad for a sale at a furniture store and decided to give them a gift for Jason's birthday. The list was endless. Paid electric bills when they had problems at work, money for a down payment on a new car, help with paying for health insurance. Each time, I found a diplomatic way to hand over the money without hurting their pride. And how many times have I solved their problems through people I know? When Jason was in trouble with the IRS, I asked an accountant friend of mine to handle the situation for free. When Brittany needed a good gynecologist, I made an appointment with Dr. Smith for an unscheduled appointment. Even this insurance company job wasn't my first career help. 5 years ago, I had recommended Jason to an acquaintance of mine for an initial position. At the time, he was just one of many candidates with no experience, but my word got him an interview. All these years later, I thought I was helping my son get back on his feet, that my support was temporary, that sooner or later he would become independent and be able to provide for the family without help. But instead, I raised a dependent who took my help for granted. The worst part was realizing that Jason hadn't even tried to hide the source of their wealth from his wife. Brittany knew exactly where the money for their lifestyle was coming from, who was helping them solve problems, who was opening doors in the right offices, and instead of gratitude, she felt envy and irritation. I got up from my chair and went to the window. My garden stretched beyond the glass, the neatly trimmed rose bushes Edward had planted with his own hands, the old oak tree where we'd once picnicked with little Jason. All of this would have passed to his son someday, would have been the foundation of his own children's well-being. But now I wasn't sure I wanted to leave an inheritance to a man who didn't know how to appreciate it. Brittany was already mentally managing my jewelry, probably making plans for the house and the savings. And Jason was acquiescing to those plans, seeing nothing inappropriate about waiting for his mother to die. In the kitchen, I put the kettle on and sat down at the table where I usually ate breakfast in the morning. Here, I read the newspaper, planned my day, and sometimes talked on the phone with my girlfriends. simple, everyday things that formed the basis of my life after my husband's death. But tonight changed everything. I could no longer pretend that I had a loving family ready to support me in times of need. I could no longer count on my son as a support in my old age. Jason had shown his true colors, and I didn't like them. The kettle whistled, interrupting my thoughts. I brewed chamomile tea, the same kind I drank with Edward in the evenings when we discussed the day before. A habit I couldn't break even after 3 years of being single. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of hot tea, I thought about what to do next. Breaking up with my son didn't mean the end of my life. I had other interests, other people, other ways to spend my time. The book club, volunteering at the animal shelter, the traveling I kept putting off. Maybe it was time to start living for myself instead of my ungrateful relatives. Edward always said that after he died, I should find a way to be happy. He didn't want me to become a martyr, sacrificing myself for my children and grandchildren. I remembered an old conversation I'd had with my husband a few months before he died. We were sitting in the same kitchen. He was reading the newspaper. I was preparing dinner. Suddenly, he put the paper down and said, "Connie, if something happens to you, I don't want Jason to feel obligated to sacrifice his life for me." "Why would you think that?" I wondered. "Because I see you living with his problems," Edward answered. "And I'm afraid he'll get used to taking sacrifice for granted." At the time, I thought my husband was judging my son too harshly. Jason was a good boy, just a little infantile. As he grew older, he would mature, become more responsible, and learn to appreciate our help. But Edward, as usual, was right. He saw further than I did, understood people better. And if he were alive today, he'd probably say, "I warned you." I finished my tea and looked at the clock. It was 1:30 in the morning. Tomorrow would be a normal day breakfast, reading the newspaper, a walk in the garden, perhaps a visit to the jeweler to repair a necklace. Simple chores that didn't require the involvement of a son or daughter-in-law. Going up to the bedroom, I slowly undressed and got ready for bed. The mirror reflected a 75-year-old woman who looked tired but not broken. There were red streaks around her neck from the chain Brittany had so rudely ripped off. The marks would be gone by morning, but the memory of that evening would remain forever. As I lay in bed, I thought about some important decisions I would have to make tomorrow. Revise the will, cancel all automatic transfers of money to my son's account. Maybe change the locks just in case. Jason had a spare key to my house, but I'd already made the most important decision tonight. No one else would take advantage of my kindness with impunity. No one would see my help as an obligation on my part. If that means loneliness, then let it be loneliness. Better to be alone than surrounded by people who only see you as a source of profit. The morning began with a phone call. I woke up at 7:30 to the trill of a cell phone lying on my bedside table. The number was unfamiliar, and I hesitated for a while whether to answer it so early. "Constance Sanford speaking," I said, sitting up in bed. "Mrs. Sanford, this is Tom Wilson, your son's colleague." The voice sounded agitated. "I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I thought you should know." "What's wrong?" I interrupted him, even though I knew exactly why he'd called. "Jason was called in to see Mr. Harrington this morning. They say his appointment has been canceled. What's more, he's been reassigned to his old position, but to a different department, with a pay cut." I remained silent, listening to the man's agitated voice. Tom was clearly unaware of my role in what was happening and was calling out of a sincere desire to warn his family of trouble. "The official reason?" I asked. "Something about not meeting the qualifications for the position. But everyone in the office is shocked. Jason is a good employee. No one understands what happened." "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "I appreciate your concern for your son. Mrs. Sanford, maybe you know what happened." There was a cautious hope in Tom's voice. Maybe there's some misunderstanding that can be corrected. There's no misunderstanding, I replied calmly. Jason got what he deserved. Tom fell silent, not knowing how to react to such words from the victim's mother. Have a good day, Mr. Wilson, I added, and disconnected the phone. I got out of bed and walked to the window. It was sunny outside, one of those clear fall days when the air is especially clear and the colors of the trees seem brighter than usual. Good weather for new beginnings. After my shower and breakfast, I sat down at the desk in the study. This was where Edward had done his paperwork in the last years of his life, where I'd sorted through his papers after the funeral. Now it was time for me to take care of my own business. The first thing I did was call the locksmith my neighbor had recommended 6 months ago. A pleasant male voice answered after the third ring. Locksmith service, Mike speaking. Good afternoon. I need to change the locks on my house. Today, if possible. Of course, ma'am. How many locks and what type? Front door and back door. I want secure locks that can't be picked by conventional means. I got it. I can come by this afternoon, around 2. Can you give me an address? I dictated the address and hung up. Then I opened my laptop and logged into online banking. I had it set up to automatically transfer $500 a month to Jason's account, grocery assistance, as I called it. The transfer was canceled with 3 mouse clicks. The next step was to call a lawyer. Robert Clark worked at the same firm where Edward had once worked, and he knew our family well. He agreed to see me tomorrow morning to make changes to the will. Serious changes? He asked. Cardinal, I answered. The primary heir no longer fit my idea of a decent person. Robert wisely remained silent, not asking too many questions. He had seen many family dramas in his years of practice and knew better than to interfere in other people's relationships. At 10:30, the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Jason. He was standing on the porch in his work suit, red-eyed and crumpled. Apparently, he'd come straight from the office, where he'd gotten some unpleasant news. Mom, open up, please, he said when I came to the door. I need to talk to you. Talk about what? I answered through the door. It seemed to me that everything had been made very clear yesterday. Mom, I got fired. There was a note of panic in his voice. Not just denied a promotion, but relegated to a lower position with a cut in pay. Not fired, but demoted, I corrected him. Tom Wilson had already called and told me all about it. You know? Jason was surprised. And you don't care? I do care, I said. I'm sorry that my son turned out to be a man unworthy of a leadership position. But that's not fair, he exclaimed. I did a good job. I had no irregularities. Fairness is a relative concept, I said philosophically. Richard thought it was fair to withdraw his decision after he'd heard about your behavior at home. There was silence outside the door. Jason must have been thinking about what I'd said, trying to find a way to argue against it. Mom, he finally said, let's meet and talk calmly. I know things went wrong last night, but we can fix this. Nothing can be fixed, I said. Some things happen only once, but that's enough to show you the true nature of a person. I won't open the door, I added when he tried to say something else. And I don't advise you to stand on my porch for too long. The neighbors might think you're bothering me. Mom, please. Tears came into Jason's voice. I'm your son. I'm your only son. My son died last night, I said coldly, when he let his wife attack his own mother and kept silent. I stepped away from the door and went into the living room. 10 minutes later, I heard the sound of a car driving away. Jason realized that persuasion was futile and left to deal with the aftermath of last night. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the locksmith arrived, a stout man in his 50s with a box of tools and samples of locks. Mike turned out to be a professional, quickly assessed the condition of the doors, and offered several options. This lock is Italian, very reliable. He showed me a metal mechanism. Protection from burglary, from drilling, from lockpicks. The guarantee is 5 years. Put it on, I agreed, and on the back door, too. While Mike worked, I made coffee and made a to-do list for the next few days. A jeweler to repair the necklace, a lawyer to change the will, a bank to close the joint safe deposit box Jason and I had. Done, ma'am, the locksmith said an hour and a half later. New keys, took the old locks with him. No one else will enter your house without authorization. I paid him and walked him to the gate. The house was really mine now, protected from unwanted visits and unpleasant surprises. In the evening, I sat in the same chair where yesterday I had been thinking about what had happened. But today's mood was radically different from yesterday's. There was no heaviness in my heart, no doubts about the correctness of the decisions I had made, only calmness and a strange sense of liberation. On the coffee table were new keys, shiny, unscratched, symbolizing a new life. Next to it was a cup of tea and a travel agency brochure. Mediterranean Cruises for the Elegant Age was the title of the offer I'd found in the mailbox. Edward had always dreamed of traveling to Greece, but we kept putting it off because of work, family circumstances, and helping our son. Now no one was stopping me from realizing that dream without my husband, but with his blessing. The phone rang. Jason's number flashed on the display, but I didn't answer it. A minute later, a message came through. Mom, Brittany wants to apologize. Can we come over tomorrow? I deleted the message without answering. Another call came in, from an unknown number. Brittany was probably calling from work or asking for someone she knew. I rejected the call and added the number to my blacklist. A peace I hadn't felt in years filled the house. No one demanding attention, no one demanding money, no one demanding solutions to their problems, no one who is critical of my lifestyle or jealous of my well-being. Just me, my interests, my plans. Taking the cruise brochure, I scrutinized the offerings. 2 weeks on the Greek islands with visits to Crete, Santorini, Mykonos, a comfortable liner, excursions, learning about history and culture, just what I needed for a fresh start. I opened my laptop and went to the travel company's website, a deluxe cabin on the top deck with a balcony and sea view. The cost didn't matter. Now that I was no longer helping Jason, I had free money for my own pleasures. It was starting to get dark outside the window, and the streetlights were coming on. Somewhere in another part of town, Jason and Brittany were discussing the disaster that had hit their lives, counting money, planning savings, looking for ways to make ends meet without my help. And I was sitting in my house, safely protected by new locks, planning a trip to a land where ancient sages pondered the meaning of life. Perhaps the Mediterranean sun would help me finally forget yesterday's unpleasantness and focus on my own happiness. 75 is not an age to end a life. It was the age for new discoveries, when you didn't have to look to other people's needs and could finally live for yourself. Edward would be glad to see that I hadn't become a victim of circumstance, but had found the strength to start over. Late that night, before I went to bed, I checked the new locks and installed the alarm system. The house was secure from outside intrusion, but the main protection was not in the locks or the alarm system. It was in me, in my determination never again to let other people parasitize my kindness. The story was over. A new life was just beginning.